I want to start with my first question and jump right in. You're an expert around money, the economy, and the history of money specifically. Walk us through, I'm holding a 50 reais, Brazilian reais right now, as we talked about. I'm in Brazil. Walk us through how we got to this story of why this paper bill has value, and walk us through the history of what was this first story of money when we look at our ancestors, and how has it evolved to, this paper bill that we hold today?
Yeah. Well, look, that's a very, very good question, Sean. In a sense, that's what the book is about. It's the evolution. It's called The History of Money, but it could equally be called the evolution of money. The first thing is that I have been a monetary economist for 30 years, central banker, investment banker, then at my own, then economist, writing books, doing TV programs, all about economics, money, macroeconomy, all that sort of stuff. And one thing that struck me was that economists, my tribe, who took it upon ourselves to explain the story of money to people, don't really understand the full essence of what money is, what it does to us, what it makes us do, why money is sexy, why it's transgressive, why it's dangerous, why it's power, why it puts a value on desire, all these things, why it's a motivational force. Because I think that their view of money is too narrow. So I thought the idea is that what we've got to do is we've got to go back to where money started and ask the question, why? Why? And then before we ask the question why, a light at an idea of what it is. What is this money thing? And I think what makes the book different in many ways is it comes to the conclusion at the very start and sets this up for the reader that money is a technology. And not only a technology, money is a social technology which was invented by humans to deal with an increasingly complicated world. So much so that when you get to now, it's inconceivable to understand the world we live in today without understanding our relationship with money. So once you take that on board, Sean, that it's a technology that we invented, then let's see when we invented it and why did we invent it? And more to the point, then why subsequently did money become adopted by civilization after civilization after civilization willingly to become this extraordinary international language that we all understand. So when you look at human history, for the first about 300,000 years of our existence, anthropologists call us a pyrophyte species, which is a species that was adapted to and constantly adapted with one technology, the technology fire. What the book contends is in the last 5,000 years, we have become a plutophyte species, which is a word I made up, so you might not have heard it before, which is that we are a species now that is adapted to and constantly adapting with another technology, which is money. And the reason we invented money is if you go back to the first iterations of money, what you see is that as humans left our nomadic existence, let's say 10,000 years ago, and beginning the process of becoming domesticated, becoming urbanized, what you see is that humans began to live in increasingly urban type settings. The main one of which I use in the book is the Sumer civilization, which would have existed now in what is southern Iraq. And that's a civilization that existed about 5,000 years ago. And it's one of the very first urban centers. We experienced probably about 80,000 people live in the city at a certain stage. But what we see around 5,000 years ago is the co-evolution of technologies like money, social technologies like money, like organized religions, like legal systems. Then we see things like numerals, we see counting, we see writing, all these things which we would probably now, fair to say, regard as the building blocks of human civilization. They all co-evolve at around the same time. Now, why is that? Or why might that have been? And I think it's because what happened is as humans moved from hunter-gatherers, where we were really hanging out with our own families, our larger kin. We knew everybody. And we became domesticated. We began to have much more complex relationships with far more people. And we had to introduce technologies to allow us to deal with the complexity of life. And one of those technologies was money, A, because it allowed us to trade with each other, but B, it also allowed us to come to some common idea about value, which is essential. And it allowed us to create hierarchies. It also motivated us. So what you see is that money emerges when urban civilization emerges. It is for the first 400 or 500 years, into 1,000 years, it's an urban concept, but then gradually becomes more widespread. And so I think the first thing to understand is it evolves a long time ago at the same time as human progress is beginning to accelerate. My central idea is that it is the foundational technology of human civilization. Without it, it's inconceivable to understand our past. And the fascinating thing, Sean, and I'll shut up here because I've been going on a bit. The fascinating thing is that it's entirely invented. It doesn't exist. It's a figment of the human imagination. It only exists in the human world. It doesn't exist in the animal world. It is a purely human force. And so what I look at it is, it's A, it's a technology, and B, it's a force that propels humanity forward. It's not always good. There's lots of downsides, but it's complex because humans are complex. It's not that money's complex, it's that we are complex. But if you look at it as a propulsion force, almost like a Promethean force. So if you think in the ancient world, the Greeks, for example, they thought the world was driven by 4 natural elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. They're the 4 elements, the natural elements that drove the ancient world. I think about 5,000 years ago, we introduced a 5th element. And that 5th element is money. And that is the human element that really drives human progress forward. So that's the big sort of cathedral view of why I believe it's important to wrestle the understanding of money from the narrow gauge philosophy that largely dominated my profession, the economics profession, and open it up to anthropology, to biology, to history, to technology, all those sort of things.
Yeah, I love that. And the core thesis here is that at the end of the day, money is a human story that we've invented. You know, take this paper bill here. When you kind of break it down, all really is it's just nice artwork on a paper. Like there shouldn't be any fundamental value here, right? You could change this word to Mexico or Paraguay, and all of a sudden it loses the value. But it has value because we've told ourselves the story of why it has value.
Precisely. And in a way, money is a bit like a religion. That in order for money to be universally accepted, we have to, in a way, have a massive collective suspension of our critical faculties. So we have to assume away the rational delineation of this is a piece of paper here, but it doesn't have value, whereas that is a piece of paper there in your hand, which does have value. You can go and buy a beer down the road, okay? So how did we arrive at this? How do we arrive at this sort of universal complicity? And not so much how, but why? And the reason the why is, I believe, very interesting. So when we were kids, we were told that money is the source of all evil. Mm. And when I was a young fella, that sounded right. But there's another interpretation, which is that money was originally a tool for peace. Now, bear with me. The idea is that in a non-monetized society, if I wanted what Sean had, I would have to kill you or damage you to get that. In a monetized society, I can exchange a piece of paper or the dots on a bank account with you, and I can acquire what you have without going to war, without doing any damage to you. So there's a very famous French sociologist called Marcel Mauss, and he said in the 19th century, he was talking about the monetary economy, initially gifting economy. And he said, look, in order to trade, man first had to put down the spear. And it's the trading side that gives money its sort of alternative to war idea in the ancient worlds. And what we see is when you begin to look at the first person we ever saw whose name was written down, you might think it's a great god or it's a great character of literature, or was a great king. No, it wasn't. The first name we ever see written down in the Sumerian alphabet cuneiform was a guy called Kushim. Now, what was he? He was a home brew hustler. He was just a guy making his own home brew. And the problem was he'd borrowed barley, he'd borrowed money, and he had to give that money back in barley. The rate of interest was 33%, so it's a lot of money he's got to give back. And suddenly what you see is you realize that money makes the ancient modern. I mean, I can understand Kushim. I can understand the poor guy is waking up at night and he's thinking, shit, what happens if the harvest fails, the weather changes, what's going to happen will be, and of course, in those days, if you didn't pay back your debt, chances are you end up with your family in indentured slavery. So the stakes were high. So what I'm saying is money makes the modern world seem the ancient world seem very, very modern. So what I try to do in the book is I start with the Sumerians, then I go to the Lydians, then I go to the Greeks, then the Romans, and all this, what we would call now, in fairness, as it was written by a white, almost pink Irishman in northwestern Europe, there is a European Eurocentricity about the characters, simply because I know those characters. That's my intellectual, my historical, my cultural hinterland. If it were written by an Asian writer, it would be very, very different because, of course, the characters would be different, the references would be different, but the story is the same. The story is the relationship between, and you're a technologist, you know that what humans have always been is we are brilliant. Maybe what makes us different to any animals, and maybe what's actually propelled us to the top of the tree, is that we are amazing at solutions, finding solutions. Humans are great at finding solutions to problems. And we find solutions to problems using technology. And that technology can be physical, okay, as in we're talking over Riverside together. That's a physical technology. Or it can be social. And a social technology is a technology that makes us collaborate and cooperate better at scale. So using more of our brains, using more of our energies. And the key social technology, in my opinion, people would say it's the legal system. I would say it's actually the monetary system. So that's what we get to. And the stories are all interweave and interwoven simply because, as I explained to my undergraduate class at Trinity College where I teach, stories are how humans communicate. If you have a child, and if you have a child who at night is very, very upset and you want to soothe the child, you tell the child stories. You never soothe the child with algebra, right? You need to actually tell stories because that's the way, the pathways in our brains that we have inherited to understand the world. So I've tried to do that in the book as well.
Yeah, and money is, when I think about money, and you brought up this idea of organized religion, it's in the similar context of really what makes us human. It's what differentiates animals versus humans. This is what Yuval Noah Harari talks about in Sapiens is the reason why humans have thrived is our ability to not only tell, but believe in stories, and what allows us to have 7 billion people at scale, and also the ability to cooperate and to communicate. And money is so fascinating when you think about it that way.
It's the best story ever sold. That's it.
Yes.
It really is, and the reason is it's based on a myth that money is real. And that's a fascinating idea to stand back and digest, that we are motivated by, if you think about modern societies, the relationship between buyer and seller, between ruler and ruled, between employer and employee, between the state and the citizen, between the producer and his or her supplier, all these relationships are mediated by money. All these relationships are given value and given substance by money. If you think about the extraordinary way in which we all live together as 7 billion, what we do is we live together, and the only way we can live together is if we have an element of trust between each other. Because trust is the psychological gel that allows us to live in peace together. Now, the beautiful thing about money is it amplifies trust. So, for example, I'm here in New York. I went up and I got a coffee this morning. Got up, went down, got a coffee. And the person behind the till, she knows nothing about me. I know nothing about her. I look different. I speak with a different accent. I think originally she probably started speaking in a language that wasn't English. I give her a dollar bill, and suddenly all the questions that she might have, is this guy trustworthy? Do I know him? Will he default? Is he good for credit? All these things disappear in this $1 bill because we both trust the money. And in the money and in the price of money is a massive information. It's almost an encyclopedia of information about who we are, what we value, etc. So when you think about trust is so essential. And if you look at money as an amplifier of trust, because what it does is it takes away the need for me to know anything about you and you to know anything about me in order to do the transaction and trade with each other, then what you see is that this is the most marvelous story because we are inventing it every single minute of the day.
Yeah.
So it's a really beautiful way of looking at things.
Yes. I want to just kind of take us back. Before this history or the story of money was created, how did humans transact? I mean, what were some of the most common ways that humans had an alternative to money before it was invented? And also, what was the first money concept? Like, what was the first creation of it?
So the book opens in the Congo. It actually closes in the Congo too, which is interesting. But in 1951, a number of Belgian archaeologists digging in the Congo Basin, in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, found a very small bone, which was the femur of a small baboon, maybe a chimpanzee, some primate. And on that bone were all these thousands of little indentations. And they were very perplexed by this, and they brought it back to Belgium. I actually went to see this in the Belgian Museum of Sciences a couple of years ago, this particular little artifact. But on that bone, if you imagine it's like a pen like this, and there's little indentations on it. And what we know is that this is the very first evidence of humans counting. So it's 19,000 years ago in Africa. Now, it makes complete sense that it's in Africa. Why? Because we all came out of Africa, all of us. And the great march of humanity comes from Africa. So it's not surprising that the first evidence of counting comes from Africa. Now, the question is, what were they counting? And what archaeologists, historians, anthropologists believe was this is the very, very first evidence of a tally stick, or even a blockchain, to put it in modern day parlance, that it was in effect a Stone Age blockchain. So what it was, the indentations were, Sean owes me money, he gives David money, he owes David something. After a period of time, we clear our debts, then we scratch out the notch, okay? And then the question is, what were we trading? But more importantly, what was the settlement day? So what it's thought, and again, this is in the realms of speculation, that very, very ancient societies had settlement days with each other, maybe after a year or a lunar year or whatever day they chose. And on that day, they cleared the slate. And this Shango bone is the very first evidence of that slate. Now, what did they clear the slate with? Obviously, other humans. So the original sin of humanity is that money was slavery at the beginning. So if Sean owed David something, he probably paid David in live humans.
Man.
And that goes back thousands of years. And then what we see, if we come to 5,000 years ago, we see the beginning of money based around grain. So a shekel was the Sumerian original currency. A drachma was the Greek original currency. The amazing thing about a drachma, it means actually a handful in Greek. So it means a handful of grain. Now, why grain? Because grain was the staple upon which urbanized societies were built. Because grain had a surplus, you understood its value because you were hungry, it gave you a certain amount of energy. And of course, energy was the force that all humans needed. So what we go is we gradually begin to see money based on a value, the common understanding of which was grain, because grain made sense to people. And then, of course, you had societies that generated grain surpluses. Now, why did they generate grain surpluses? They generated grain surpluses so that they could actually, A, feed themselves, but B, humans could begin to move away from farming, generating the grain themselves, to other professions, to being high priests, to being plumbers, to being carpenters, to being all sorts of artisans, and that they didn't have to feed themselves, which means you needed the granary to feed themselves. And the granary, in effect, was the source of all money. So the bigger the granary, the more money the society had. In effect, the granary was like the central bank these days. And as a result of that, what you see is this evolution of societies based on grain and grain surpluses, grain being used as money, people beginning to understand value, and gradually society coalescing around some of the hierarchies that we still see today, which is kind of amazing, given that all this was happening 3,000 years before Christ, 5,000 years ago.
Yeah. And when was the introduction of the silver coin? Was that the Roman Empire?
That was a crowd called the Lydians.
Lydians.
So if you might have remembered the Midas touch, that myth, Midas was the king, original king of the Lydians. There was a chap called Croesus. There's an expression in English going out of fashion now, but used to be used by my grandmother, a fellow being as rich as Croesus, right? So Croesus was a very, very wealthy man. Who was he? He was the king of the Lydians. The Lydians were a proto-Greek civilization which existed in Turkey around 1000 BC. And they are the first people to have minted gold first and created gold coins first and created silver coins. So they're the people who basically take money out of our brains, which the Sumerians had. So the Sumerians had a legal system, which was based on this idea of settling your debts every year. They had rates of interest. The Sumerians had very, very convoluted and very, very sophisticated financial models of factory farms 2,000 or 3,000 years before Christ, which is just kind of amazing when you look at the architectural evidence. But the Lydians, they were the people who first minted coins. And they were into a totally different world. And then they give that technology to the Greeks, who were inveterate minters of silver coins. And one thing that's always fascinated me about the Greeks was, why did Greek civilization break the intellectual glass ceiling? So why did the Greeks come up with geometry, rationality, logic, Greek philosophy, Greek democracy, Greek republicanism, Greek theater and art? Why was it this society came up very, very quickly with a whole host of revolutionary intellectual breakthroughs that had eluded previous societies? And I think it's because the Greek society was the very first monetized society in the world. And once you begin to have a monetized society based on coinage, what you do is you compel people to do mathematics every day in their heads, right? To add, to subtract, to count. And with a numerical society, so a monetized society becomes a numerical society. And a numerical society becomes a society that's based on rationality, because you're into being precise. And a precise society doesn't dream, doesn't speculate. It wants to be a rational society. So when I look at the Greek society, I look at the way the Greeks moved from mythos to logos, from mythology to logic in a very quick period. And it seems to me that the only way you can explain that is that there was a propulsive force which was changing the way they thought about the world. And I think that force was money. And by making them precise, it's only a hop, skip, and jump from being precise to being rational to demanding proof, which is, of course, what all Greek and Socrates' methods based on. And as a result of that, all these rational leaps that the Greeks made had to be the result of something that was changing in their worldview. And I think that was their day-to-day use of coinage, was a massively influential, intellectual, psychological, and ultimately social force that propelled the Greeks forward. And then the Greeks go to the Romans, and away we go.
And here we are. Here we are with paper bills.
Here we are.
Now, David.
And here we are. And the Dutch introduced the paper bills in Europe. I mean, of course, when you will enjoy this as someone of Asian descent. Really, when you start writing a book like this, you realize that almost everything came from Asia, specifically China. So paper money, all these things we talk about. You know, people say Marco Polo went to China and discovered this, that, and the other. Well, in fact, the Chinese were way ahead of any sort of Christian culture for miles and for centuries in all these areas. So the first paper money comes from China. But the Europeans sort of turbocharged it in the 16th century, beginning with the Dutch and then the British and on from there. And of course, the Americans.
Yeah, I've even heard that gunpowder, China was initially not using for offense or for battles, but there was evidence of them having access to gunpowder, even early signs of like printing. I think China had access to before, so it's
they were miles ahead.
Yeah,
they were miles ahead. Everything basically comes from China, and today everything's made in China. So it's kind of you know what I mean. So it's a kind of there was a 2,000-year hiatus where the rest of the world thought they were doing things, and now we're back to square one.
Yeah. Now, David,
it's interesting.
I'm fascinated personally with all of the history of money and the story of money. As a listener, I'm going, all right, this stuff is interesting, but David, like why is it important to understand the history and story of money and how it works? How does it help me in my current life think about money, or how does it benefit me? Why should I care about this?
Well, I think it's critical that everyone understands not just the origin, but the technocratic detail of where money comes from now, who produces it, who issues it, how things can go wrong, how things can go right. Where does society go from here? If you believe the thesis that money is the foundational technology of the human race, or a foundational technology, how does that explain the world at the moment, right? So in the last part of the book, I bring the reader up to now. Now, one thing that is fascinating and has always fascinated me as a former central banker is that people assume that there is somebody in control of money around the world. That's a sort of a bedtime story that we tell ourselves. Look, don't worry about it. Somebody's in charge. What many years of thinking about this has led me to the conclusion that, you know what, nobody's in charge. And I'll give you an example of that. So the 2008 financial crisis, or maybe one that might be emerging at the moment, right? We kind of all thought, okay, well, the central bankers, they've got this. And then we realized they didn't have it. And we realized the banking system was out of control. And you think, okay, well, how does that happen? So as I've always said, that, the easiest way to rob a bank is to run it. Okay? Banks go bad from the inside out. And why do they go bad from the inside out? They go bad from the inside out because the bank creates money out of nothing. It's called fractional reserve banking. What it actually means is if Sean goes in tomorrow to whatever bank you have and you say, I'd like to buy a car. And the car dealer says the new car is worth, I don't know, $40,000. You don't have $40,000. But you go to the bank and you say to the bank, can I take a 5-year car loan for this? The bank says, yeah, Sean's good for his credit. We look at his credit rating. He hasn't defaulted before. He's got a nice apartment in Brazil. He's got lots of good shit going on. Yeah, he's good for the money. The bank then make that money up and put it in your deposit account tomorrow morning. That money didn't exist today. It exists tomorrow. Nobody in the bank phoned up the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and said, I've got some guy called Sean Kim. I'm going to give him 50 grand. Can I have permission? No. They created out of nothing. So once you understand that money is invented in commercial banks out of nothing, under license by the central banks, you realize that the real generative power of money is what we call finance. So when we think about money, 10% is what you just showed me, currency and coins. 90% is finance. Now, what is finance? Finance is a parallel universe of money, which is underpinned by reputation, your reputation, by credibility, your credibility, by a set of legal systems, checks and balances that we've inherited over the years. And it is the engine room of modern banking, whether that banking be private equity and or investment banking and or commercial banking, or even a post office account that you might have in the sort of European sense, right? And in finance is the alchemy of money, because through finance, money is created essentially out of nothing. It is magicked up. Now, what holds that whole thing together is we're back to our friend trust. I trust you're good for the money. You trust I'm good for the money. Now, as long as the trust in the system does not break down, that system can fuel the global economy into the future. But when the trust breaks down, when the bank goes bust, when people begin to think, hold on a second, is Sean actually good? Like your investors in your tech company, at the moment they're with you because you're telling them a great story. Your story is that whatever your product is going to be better than the other guys, and it's going to work, right? So they're backing your storytelling. It's the same thing in finance. We're backing each other's storytelling. Now, once those stories begin to become incredible, then the trust in the system collapses. Then the alchemy of money evaporates. Then you get this enormous of stampede of fear. And we get to ourselves in a situation where we were in 2008. So in order to understand how the financial system works, I think for your listeners, it's essential to understand this difference of finance, and what it is, and where it comes from, and how it's regulated, how it's not regulated, because focusing on currency is only 1/10 of the story.
Interesting. And knowing everything you know about money, and the fact that at the end of the day, we're all telling ourselves a story, and we may have different stories that we tell ourselves, depending on the environment that you grew up in, depending on how you studied and what subjects you studied or what you consume in terms of information. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about money that most people have since growing up?
Okay, I'll give you a story. The two most in the English canon of science, the two most heralded names are Charles Darwin, first of all. Let's just talk about Charles Darwin first. Let's just give you two. Let's give you one, right? So Charles Darwin is the father of modern biology, the father of modern evolutionary theory. Okay. The other is Isaac Newton, who is, in a sense, the father of physics, our friend of the gravity. So you take Isaac Newton and you take Charles Darwin, two incredibly brilliant men, amazing minds. Both of them lost their shirts. They lost a fortune on speculation, right? So you, the greatest minds of their time, couldn't understand money and what money does to people. So Darwin speculated on railway shares and lost a fortune. And Isaac Newton speculated on what was called the South Sea Bubble, which was an incident of speculation in the 1720s. Now, we look at something like AI now. So you say, okay, why are so many incredibly intelligent people betting that one technology will change the world and that the companies that they have bought at incredibly high valuations will all be successful when we know that that can't be possible? Only one or two can emerge as the top dogs. And the reason is that once you begin to think about money, you understand that because it's a social construct, because it's an invented notion, you have to throw into the mix human and group psychology. FOMO, fear of missing out, the fact that we're a social animal, the fact that we aren't rational, we're highly irrational, the fact that we get giddy together and we get depressed together, the fact that we are gelled together by this bizarre notion called hope. Now, what is equity? If you hear in finance, equity is nothing more than hope, right? I hope I buy equity in Sean's company in the hope that that's worth some value. So once you put all these sort of emotional aspects into the story of money, then you begin to see why we make mistakes. So what I would say, the first lesson that everybody should know is that the most intelligent people do not understand money. And humans constantly repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again when it comes to distinguishing between hope and reality. And that is why we get booms and busts and credit cycles like the one we're in now. I think that's the first takeaway that everybody who's listening to the show should take away. That in order to understand money, you've got to understand the creature that's using money, which is us. And therefore, you've got to understand human nature, which is amplified and degraded by money in and of the same time.
Yeah. I remember growing up, one of the most popular books that allowed us to understand how money works and how to earn money was Rich Dad Poor Dad. We actually had Robert Kiyosaki on the show, and he just
I remember that book. Yeah, still selling really well.
Still selling really well, and just the way he explained in a simplified manner for everyone to understand was just such a breakthrough for people that never really understood about money. And he talks about this poor dad and how he thought about money and what he teaches about money and versus his rich dad. And I'm curious from an economist perspective and someone that's an expert in money, if you compare the lower to middle or even upper class and you compare their perception of money and their stories of money, what are the key differences that you see as you go up the classes, even up to maybe the ultra wealthy like Jeff Bezos to Elon Musk? What's the key differences that you see?
Okay, I'm going to give you an answer you probably don't expect. Sure. I think the key difference between rich and poor people are time horizons. So what I've noticed in Ireland, where I live, amongst the very poor people in the country, poverty obliterates the future. And by that I mean that poverty makes you think about today and not tomorrow. And as you move up, so why is that? It's because you need the cash today. Why do you think payday loans are pushed upon poor people? Rich people don't need payday loans. Poor people need payday loans because they need the money today. Why do they need the money today? It's because they need to spend the money today to survive. The time horizons of a rich person, like a middle-class person, I'd send my kids to college. I'd say to my son, who I'm visiting here in New York, who's working in a bar, he's just finished college, he's having a laugh. But we sat down last night and he said, look, Dad, what am I going to do? Where do I want to be in 5 years' time? Now, already, that is the luxury of the middle classes, because he knows that he can postpone making a decision. He can add to his human capital. He can experiment because he's got these longer time horizons, because he knows that if push comes to shove, I will help him out. Okay? So if you think about, and then Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, they have incredibly long time horizons. Musk wants to go to Mars, for God's sake, right?
Bezos has his 10,000 a year clock project, right? That he's building.
I didn't know about that. I'm not, it's funny for somebody who's an economist, I'm not that attracted by rich people. Yeah. They don't really interest me any more than anybody else. But what is he? He's got a 10,000 years clock.
He's all about thinking long term. So this is actually perfect in line with what you're talking. He's building one of the largest monuments of a clock that's going to go around, but every little second is like a year or something. And then by the time it makes it, it's going to be 10,000 years.
So if you think about it, so I think that a really good way of looking at the difference between rich people and poor people are time horizons. Money allows you imagine a future for yourself that has not yet been realized. And as a result of that, richer kids go to college. Richer kids take years out. Richer kids plan. Richer kids build businesses with 10-year time horizons. Why? Because nobody is requiring them to have cash today. Why? Because the banking system gives them the luxury of a 10-year loan or a 20-year loan, or God forbid, a 30-year treasury, right? The poor guy, on the other hand, nobody gives him money. Nobody trusts him to pay. And the irony is, Sean, we know that the very rich default at much higher numbers than the very poor. So there's a thing called microbanking, which was set up in Bangladesh. Guy who won the Nobel Prize. It was about giving small amounts of money to poor people, allowing them to build very small companies. The rates of default are almost zero. Whereas we know in the financial crisis, it was all the fucking banks who defaulted, right? Think about it. They walked away from their loans. They went bust. Donald Trump is a great example. Man is a walking bankruptcy, right? Because he thinks like a rich guy. And so I think if you understand this time horizon, I think that's a very valuable way of looking at it. And as you said, it's underscored. I didn't know that Jeff Bezos had a 10,000-year clock. Well, there you go. So the richest man in the world has the longest time horizons.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, speaking of rich people defaulting, I mean, I think it's the saying goes something like, if you owe the bank $1,000, you're screwed.
Yeah.
But if you owe the bank $1 billion, the bank is screwed, right?
The bank's screwed. Yeah. So, I mean, so if you look at, the way in which we deal with money. I mean, again, I'm an economist. Economists are not and should never be, I think, demanded to give financial advice, because I think there's two different creatures. I think there's a finance person who, like Robert, for example, will give you advice on how to run your life. Economist's job is almost like the high priest, is to figure out how the whole thing gels together, and how if we pull this lever, what will happen 4 or 5 iterations down into the economy. But I think, to come back to your basic point, I think if you look at time horizons, what happens is that poverty actually obliterates and drives a sledgehammer through the future. And that keeps people poor, unfortunately.
Yeah. And is this why you talk about why when someone is poor, it's not necessarily about their raw intelligence and their ability. It's just more about the environmental factors, because it kind of comes down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs in some ways, where people are just trying to survive. It's this human primal need to survive and put a roof over the top of our heads and to feed our families. And they don't have the ability. I mean, I don't want to say ability, but that's not the forefront of their minds. Whereas if you grew up with a rooftop over your head, education, a saving, you have the ability to think long term.
I mean, if you look at it, Sean, I think so you're of Korean descent. I'm Irish, right? So you think about our great-grandparents. My great-great-grandparents starved to death. Their family starved, right? Now that's real poverty. Starving to death is real poverty. And it took my family probably 4 or 5 generations to get to where we are now, right? So to come back to your point, one of the reasons that it takes so long is because there are so many institutional, cultural, national barriers put up to people that, one of the promises of the United States is you can get rich very quickly, but we know that that's actually a promise that is unfulfilled. It takes a long time for society to become dexterous with money. You think about Korea. Korea is an amazing story. In 1963, Korea had the same GDP per head as the countries of West Africa. Today, South Korea is the most successful economy on earth, bar none. On earth, bar none. And we know that because now Korea is not exporting manufacturing goods, you're exporting your culture. K-pop. I mean, the greatest sign that America was on top of the world was rock and roll, right? It sold its popular culture to Europeans through the human that was Elvis Presley. And the Americans never looked back. It sold its movies to us. It sold Hollywood to us. It sold its storytelling. What is Korea doing now? This is an amazing story. It's selling its K-pop. It's selling its soap operas. It's selling its movies are winning Oscars. So what I see is societies can change, but it takes time.
Yeah.
But once you see a society selling its culture to another society, you know it's really reaching the apex.
What are your thoughts as an economist? I think Trump just recently came up with this idea of putting $1,000 into every US born baby. And obviously that's an incentive to have more babies because of the potential population decline. But in terms of the fact that I don't know if $1,000 is really going to make a huge impact, but by the time you're 22 to 25, that could easily become, $10,000 to $15,000 depending on the rate that you have. What are your thoughts on that and how that could be impactful for someone that is, for I guess the population as a whole in terms of the ability to think more long term?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's interesting. So on the one hand, I wouldn't besmirch or degrade any initiative that gives poor people an apparent bigger stake in the future. Okay? Now, whether it's a check written by the state, whatever it happens to be, I think that's really, really fascinating. There's very interesting psychological trials done, again, in the United States in the 1990s on a checking account that was given. So there were two subsets of very poor people, and one subset were given an account, an education account that could be accessed when the kids were 18. So these kids are all from the same background, and the other subset were not. And what you find is that the kids who were given the checking account begin to start to do better in school at the age of 5 or 6, very, very early. So they're doing better in maths, they're doing better in spelling, they're doing better in their basic cognitive skills, right? Writing, spelling, maths, right? Now the question is why? And the answer is that the parents who had the checking account begin to believe in the future, a future that they never thought they would have, and they change their own behavior at home because they realize their kids now have a stake. So they're sitting up reading with them, they tell them to go to school, they're not looking the other way when the kids don't go to school, they're doing their basic mathematics with them. So something changes in your head when you have a stake. So this is why that Trump initiative has to be good. But, and here's the big but, there's another thing in economics called the paradox of aggregation. And the best way to think about this is if you go to a football match, right? Soccer, American football, whatever your weakness is, baseball, right? And you're at a football match and your team is doing really well, okay? And the guy in front of you stands up. Now, he has no idea that by standing up, he is forcing you to stand up to get a better view. So he stands up to get a better view, then you've got to stand up. Then the guy behind you's got to stand up, and the guy behind him, and behind him, and behind him, and suddenly the entire stadium is standing when we had paid to sit. Now, what does that tell you? That is that the paradox of aggregation is what is good for the individual is not always good for the collective. Mm. So by giving a check to every single person, you actually eliminate the comparative advantage of having the check in the first place. So it's the same equivalent as the guy standing up to get a better view. He forces you to stand up, then you force the other guy to stand up, and suddenly none of us has a better view and we're all standing. So that is the paradox of aggregation. So in the aggregate, it may not necessarily have the same propulsive force as it does on a specific individual basis, but nonetheless, it is a far better policy to give poor kids 1,000 euros, or let's say, for example, it is, think about in the billionaire idea. So a billionaire is 1,000 million. Yeah? Okay? Right? So basically, is it better for 1,000 or a million people to have $1,000 or one guy to have $1 billion? What do you think?
From a societal perspective?
Yeah.
The latter. Oh, sorry.
Exactly.
Yes.
The former.
Yes.
It's better to have 1 million people with $1,000.
Yes.
Right? Like a billionaire is a kind of a ridiculous notion because they hoard money and they don't spend the money, and there's a finance industry all constructed around keeping them with their money. It's far better for society if you take $1 billion for 1 million people to have 1,000 bucks than one guy to have 1 billion bucks, right? And you can look at that Trump idea in the same way.
Mm.
So yes, for society it's far better. But it doesn't mean that everyone's going to progress at the same time because of the paradox of aggregation. But the original idea is that you change your behavior when you have a stake in society. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is also the question of correlation versus causation, right? Similar to how people that floss have also better metrics and other health metrics, but it's probably the conscientiousness that allows them to get there rather than
exactly
the actual variable. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I want to go deeper into giving some practical tips for people around money. If you can design the educational system purely just based around how to build wealth, how to keep it, what are the 2 to 3 core subjects that you would focus on teaching and making sure everybody masters?
I would make sure that every kid knows how to play basketball cards. That's the only thing. Do you remember basketball cards?
I remember
baseball
Pokemon cards.
Baseball. Okay, Pokemon. It's your generation, right? So when I was a kid, we used to play this thing called football cards. So all the kids in my class would have this deck of cards. They would buy this deck of cards and they trade with each other. I'll give you 2 Chelsea footballers for a Man United footballer. The price of Liverpool FC is falling. I don't want those guys, right? When we were 8 or 9, we, little kids in Dublin, in an economy that was on its knees, by the way, without thinking about it, we understood price, cost, value, supply, demand, the market, scarcity. We understood instinctively the rubrics of the market economy, which is why I think money is second nature to humans. Yeah. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's like language in the sense that we have an innate ability, but what I have is we have an inherited social DNA around money because we've been using it for so long. So what I would say to kids, when I get 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds coming to my class in university, and they think economics is really hard, it's really technical, it's mathematical, it's too much statistics, too much econometrics, it seems difficult, these charts and graphs and all these metrics, this language that you're speaking is not my language. I have to relearn a new language, right? I would say, go back to when you were 8 or 9. So what you teach in class, I think we should teach the market economy based on whether it's Pokemon cards, whether it's football cards, whether it's baseball cards, that essential gelling agent, that is the market that we all get. And Chinese kids get it, Indian kids get it, African kids get it, European kids get it, because the international language of money is universal. That's all I would do. I wouldn't do anything else.
Wow.
Just that.
I'm going to send this podcast to my mom. I mean, all those years of her complaining, what are you doing with these Yu-Gi-Oh cards, these Pokemon cards? I was like, Mom, I'm telling you, one of the smartest people around money made sense.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
Yes.
But Sean, that's why you're an investor now. That's why you understand, because at a very young age, a part of your brain is firing up, curious, acquisitive, inquisitive, psychological, trying to second guess what's going on in the other guy's market. What I would do is I would just teach out nothing else and allow the kids to understand the market because they get it. What has happened in economics is we have taught economics out of children's heads when it was already there when they were 8 or 9.
Interesting. I want to go deeper into more of the psychological factors around money. You know, growing up, I didn't grow up with a lot of money. We immigrated from Korea to Canada. Mom didn't have a job. Dad got fired during the Asian recession. And because of that, we were always in pursuit of money, right? Just like a lot of people that are in any upper class or into lower class. And you can kind of see real examples of this, but I've always been curious to learn and was curious to grow, I think partly because of that. And then I look at certain people that grew up with a lot of money, maybe they inherited a lot of money, and you can see that a lot of them they kind of lack that sparkle, that twinkle in their eye. They don't really have that drive and purpose. And when you've studied a lot of these different histories around money and patterns around money, do you think the pursuit of money is more valuable than the money itself when it comes to
It's a
purpose?
great question. That's a great question. That's a great question because we might even conclude here on this idea of the pursuit of money, because what I try to tease out in the book is how innovations in money seem to kickstart innovations in a whole host of other areas, in arts and culture and finance, but how innovations in money and what we call human progress seem to go hand in hand, which is why I've gone through the printing press and the Romans and the Reformation, the Renaissance, and all those periods, and see what was actually happening to money. Because what we look at, oh, the Renaissance, that's amazing, Leonardo and how they come up with it. But actually what's an equally interesting idea is what was happening with money. And then whether or not money is the propulsive force. That what you're looking at is the difference between, let's say, like my dad, you're Canadian. So I worked in Ontario Place as a dishwasher when I was 18.
Wow.
Okay, you know that place in Toronto? Because my dad also lost his job and I had to go to Canada to work as a kid. To actually have money to come back to university in Ireland. So I was, working as a dishwasher with Chinese guys. There were just me and Chinese guys, actually. And then I worked as a dishwasher in America, which was Dominican guys and Guatemalans and all these people, and we were all kind of all at the bottom. Okay. And of course we weren't citizens, so that makes a huge difference, right? So you don't really have a legal status, you're in limbo and you're always kind of slightly looking behind your back, etc. But I think your question is really interesting. Is the pursuit of money the metric through which we regard human striving and the animation of the human desire and ambition? And I think it is. And I think we should always regard the immigrant experience as being humanity on steroids, right? How the hell do I get out of here as quick as possible, propel myself somewhere else? How am I, in effect, imagining a different future for me and my kids to the future and the present and the past of my own family? And that, I think, is the essential promise of money. It was in the Romans and it still is now, that money can change your background noise, your environment. It buys you sovereignty. You can stick it to the man. You can be independent. You can become a sovereign individual, right? In the sense that you, with money, can, not totally, but at least in part, determine your own path, right? That's the promise of money. And the societal reflection of that is collective ambition, is great art, is great philosophy, is great commerce, is this amazing thing called the indomitable human spirit, which is galvanized by the pursuit of money. But it's the actual pursuit that makes us interesting, because we're not pursuing money, we're pursuing freedom. We're pursuing a transcendental state that we are a little bit more independent. And that, I think, is so essential in the human character. And we all have it. Some of us have it in big amounts, some of us have it in not big amounts. And as you notice, some who are born very wealthy don't have it at all because they don't need to have it. So they don't have that sparkle. But I think that's the really fascinating part. And once you understand that, then the story of money is the story of humanity.
I love it. I love it. I couldn't think of a better way to end that, David. And I could talk to you for hours, but I want to be respectful of your time and make sure that people can check out the work that you're doing, including the book, The History of Money. We'll have that link down below. Where else can people find you, David, and learn about the beautiful work you're doing?
You can find me on Twitter at David McW or X. You should also come, if you're interested, I do one of the world's most bizarre festivals. I hosted it's an economics and stand-up comedy festival called Kilkenomics in the middle of nowhere in Ireland in Kilkenny, which we just finished last week. And I had a couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize winner, Paul Krugman, came over because he loved the idea of comedy and economics. And he actually said to me, he said, "Hey, David," he said, "how many tickets do you sell here?" I said, "Well, about 10, 11,000. He said, "Do you know what? You are the host of the biggest economics festival on the planet. And it's an economics and comedy festival." So that's kilkenomics.com. If you're into literature and art and the other stuff I do, another festival I do is the Dalkey Book Festival.org, DALKEY festival.org, also in Ireland. You'll catch me on X, you'll catch me on LinkedIn. And you never know, mooching around talking about economics all over the globe. Have a look at my TED talk from last year, which is on why we need more poets than economists in society. And we'll take it from there.
I love it. I love it. David, appreciate you for coming on and all the insights that you share with us today. Thank you so much.
Not at all, Sean. My pleasure. And take care of yourself.
Take care.